Rejected for her size by the man who sent for her, Eleanor finds unexpected love with a widower who values her heart over her appearance, transforming her life and revealing her true beauty to a town that once scorned her. Can Eleanor finally embrace her own worth and the weight of worth? Or will society's cruel judgments crush her chance at happiness? The train whistle screamed like a wounded animal as Eleanor Winters gripped her worn leather suitcase. Blood rushed to her fingertips, turning them pink against the brown handle. Outside the window, Clearwater Springs appeared, a splash of wooden buildings against Montana's endless sky. Eleanor's stomach twisted itself into knots that even her mother's best needlework couldn't untangle. Final stop. Everyone out. The conductor's voice boomed through the car, making a sleeping baby wail. Eleanor dabbed sweat from her upper lip. After 32 days of letter writing and 4 days on trains that smelled of tobacco and human worry, she would finally meet James Miller, the man whose elegant penmanship had promised her respect, security, and maybe someday love. His last letter rested in her pocket, paper worn soft from countless readings. "You sound like sunshine put into words," he had written. "Your photograph shows a woman of gentle beauty and thoughtful eyes." That photograph. Eleanor bit her lip, remembering how the photographer had positioned her just so, catching her face at its most flattering angle on what her mother called one of her better days. She had fasted before that sitting, wanted to show her best self to potential suitors. But that had been 8 months ago, and travel had added weight to her already full figure. The other passengers pushed past, a man in a business suit bumping her shoulder without apology. Eleanor heard a woman whisper, "Look at the size of her," followed by a companion's hushed giggle. She kept her eyes on the scuffed floor of the train car. In Philadelphia, she'd grown used to such comments. The way shopkeepers' eyes would slide over with pity, how dance partners never seemed to appear at socials, how her own father had once sighed, "If only you had your sister's build. We'd have married you off years ago." Now, at 26, she was perhaps having her last chance. Eleanor stepped onto the wooden platform, the boards creaking beneath her feet. Wind whipped her dress around her ankles and pulled strands of chestnut hair from her careful bun. She scanned the waiting faces, mostly men in work clothes grabbing parcels or greeting family. No one approached. "Miss Winters?" She turned. A tall man with a sharp jaw and perfectly trimmed mustache stood before her. His black suit looked expensive, his boots polished to a mirror shine. His eyes, cold blue like winter sky, widened slightly as they traveled from her face downward. "Mr. Miller?" Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. She stretched out her gloved hand, the way her mother had taught her when meeting gentlemen. James Miller's touch was brief, his fingers barely making contact before pulling away. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I see the journey has been substantial." The words hung in the air. Eleanor's cheeks burned hotter than the train's engine. "Yes, for days from Philadelphia can be wearing." She knew perfectly well what he meant. "Your photograph," he said, eyes narrowing slightly. It was somewhat selective in its presentation. Eleanor swallowed hard. Perhaps the camera was kind that day. "Indeed." His lips pressed into a thin line. "My buggy is this way. My sister Prudence is expecting us for tea." He turned, not offering to carry her case. Eleanor hefted the heavy suitcase, packed with every possession she hadn't sold to finance this journey, and followed him across the dusty street. A group of women standing outside the general store paused their conversation to stare openly. One leaned to whisper in another's ear, "Is your house far?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her breathing steady despite the weight of her bag and the squeeze of her corset. "Not particularly," James replied without turning, his pace never slowing to accommodate her shorter strides. The buggy waited by a hitching post, a handsome black vehicle with J. Miller, attorney, painted in gold letters on the side. James climbed in without helping her up. Eleanor struggled to lift herself onto the high step, her bag throwing her off balance. After 2 failed attempts, she set the suitcase down and used both hands to haul herself onto the seat, face blazing with humiliation. James flicked the reins without comment. As they rode, Eleanor took into town, the church with its white steeple, shops with painted signs, a schoolhouse where children played in the yard. Women in calico dresses carried market baskets. Men tipped their hats to each other on the boardwalks. She had practiced imagining this place during sleepless nights in Philadelphia, picturing herself walking these very streets as Mrs. James Miller, respected wife of the town lawyer. "Your letters describe the town beautifully," she ventured. James kept his eyes on the road. "Clearwater Springs is a respectable community. Appearances matter here." The words landed like stones in her stomach. They passed a large timber mill at the edge of town, the sound of saws ripping through it filling the air. Men with sawdust-covered clothes loaded wagons with fresh-cut lumber. One man, broad-shouldered with a red beard, looked up as they passed. For a moment, his eyes met Eleanor's. He nodded slightly before turning back to his work. James snapped the reins again. "Hayes Timber Mill," he said shortly, "largest employer in the county. The owner is a widower with young children. Lost his wife last winter to childbed fever. Tragic, but life continues." It was the most he'd said since meeting her. The Miller house appeared around a bend, white clapboard with green shutters, and a neat garden surrounded by a picket fence. A thin woman in a high-neck gray dress stood on the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. As the buggy pulled up, her expression shifted from welcome to poorly disguised shock. "My sister, Prudence," James said as he helped the horse to a stop. "She's been keeping house for me these past 5 years." Eleanor gathered her courage and her dignity as the buggy settled. Her future waited beyond that porch, if she could just make it up those 3 wooden steps without James Miller changing his mind entirely. The grandfather clock in the Miller parlor struck 3 times, each chime like a hammer on Eleanor's heart. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, catching dust motes that danced above polished furniture. Everything gleamed: the mahogany table, the silver tea service, the perfect white teeth of Prudence Miller as she smiled without warmth. "Sugar, Miss Winters?" Prudence asked, holding the silver tongs above the bowl. She was thin as a winter branch, her high collar fastened with a cameo brooch that must have been her mother's. "Just milk, thank you." Eleanor tried to sit straighter on the horsehair sofa that seemed determined to swallow her. Her best traveling dress, navy blue with lace trim she'd sewn herself, suddenly felt shabby beneath Prudence's hawk-like stare. "Brother tells me you taught at a girls' school in Philadelphia," Prudence said, passing a teacup so delicate Eleanor feared her fingers might crush it. "Yes, for 7 years. Reading and penmanship, mainly." Eleanor sipped the tea carefully. It tasted of flowers and wealth. James stood by the marble fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel as if posing for a portrait. Miss Winter's letters showed remarkable education. Her penmanship was most refined. "Yet one cannot live on penmanship alone," Prudence added, her eyes traveling over Eleanor's figure with the cool assessment of a butcher eyeing meat. "Life here requires stamina. Frontier wives must manage households, gardens, preserve food for winter." Eleanor placed her cup on its saucer with a tiny clink. "I assure you, I'm no stranger to hard work. My father died when I was 16. My mother and I took in sewing, and I helped raise my younger siblings." "Admirable," James said flatly, "but there are other considerations. Clearwater Springs may be small, but we maintain certain standards. As the town's attorney, I have a position to uphold." A clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Through the window, Eleanor watched a mother pushing a baby carriage down the street. The woman looked tired but content, her husband walking proudly beside her with a toddler on his shoulders. The family Eleanor had dared to imagine for herself. "I believe," James continued, clearing his throat, "there may have been some misjudgment on both our parts." Prudence nodded, lips pursed like a drawstring bag. "What my brother means to say, Miss Winters, is that your appearance does not match the impression given by your correspondence and photograph." Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. She had feared this moment since stepping off the train, the moment when her dreams collapsed like a poorly built house of cards. "The photograph was taken last year," she said softly. "I have never claimed to be anything other than who I am." Nevertheless, James cut in, "expectations were created that reality has failed to meet." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small envelope. I've taken the liberty of securing you lodging at Mrs. Hobbs' boarding house on Pine Street. The eastbound train returns on Saturday morning. A robin landed on the windowsill outside, tilted its head as if listening to their conversation, then flew away. Eleanor wished she could follow. You wish me to return to Philadelphia? The words tasted like ash. I believe it would be best for all concerned, James replied, still not meeting her eyes directly. I will, of course, cover the expense of your return journey. Prudence set down her teacup with a decisive click. It's the only sensible solution. You would not be happy here. What she meant was, you would embarrass us. The message hung in the air as clearly as if she'd shouted it. Eleanor placed her napkin beside her half-finished tea. 7 years of teaching proper young ladies had taught her how to maintain dignity, even when her heart was crumbling. I understand, she said, rising slowly. Thank you for your honesty, if not your welcome. James flushed slightly, looking uncomfortable for the first time. I'll have your trunk sent to the boarding house. You're very kind, Eleanor replied, the words like glass in her mouth. Outside, the perfect spring day mocked her pain. Apple blossoms drifted to the air like snow, their sweet scent a cruel reminder of hopes now withered. Eleanor clutched her reticule with white knuckles as she walked down the pristine front steps of what might have been her home. Miss Winters. James called from the doorway. When she turned, he looked smaller somehow, diminished by his own actions. I truly am sorry for the inconvenience. Inconvenience, as if her shattered future were a delayed meal or a missed appointment. Eleanor nodded once, unable to form words past a lump in her throat. The walk to Mrs. Hobbs' boarding house stretched before her like an endless desert. Each step felt heavier than the last. Women sweeping their porches paused to stare. A group of children playing hoops stopped their game to watch her pass. One boy whispering loudly, "That's the mail lady who's too big for Mr. Miller." By the time Eleanor reached Pine Street, dark clouds had gathered overhead, matching her mood. The boarding house stood at the end of the lane, a faded yellow building with peeling paint and sagging steps. Nothing like the fine Miller home with its green shutters and white picket fence. A stout woman with gray hair escaping her bun opened the door before Eleanor could knock. "You'll be Miss Winters, then," she said, eyes kind but curious. "Mr. Miller sent word to expect you. I'm Mrs. Hobbs." "Thank you for taking me in," Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Come in. Don't mind the rain starting up. Weather changes quick as a wink around here." Mrs. Hobbs ushered her inside, with a smell of baking bread and furniture polish offered small comfort. "I've put you in the back room. It's small but gets good morning light. Your trunk arrived just before you did." Mrs. Hobbs led her down a narrow hallway, chattering to fill the silence. "Supper's at 6 sharp. We have 3 other boarders, Mr. Peterson, who works at the bank, Miss Tilly, who teaches school, and old Dr. Barnes, who's mostly retired except when someone's really desperate." The room was indeed small, just space for a narrow bed, a washstand with cracked mirror, and a 3-legged table beneath the window. Eleanor sank onto the bed, the mattress thin and noisy beneath her weight. "The, gentleman explained your situation," Mrs. Hobbs said carefully, hovering in the doorway. "Men can be terrible fools, if you don't mind my saying so, judging books by covers and such." The kindness in her voice nearly undid Eleanor's fragile composure. "Thank you," she whispered, staring at her hands to hide the tears gathering in her eyes. "Well, I'll leave you to settle in. Bathroom's down the hall, shared with Miss Tilly. Supper bell rings at 5:45. Mrs. Hobbs hesitated. "If you need anything, a shoulder or just some quiet company, my door's the one by the kitchen." When Mrs. Hobbs left, Eleanor finally allowed herself to cry. Rain lashed against the window, as if the sky itself shared her grief. All her careful planning, all her hopes and dreams of a new life in the West, shattered by the disappointment in James Miller's eyes when he saw her step off that train. What would she do now? Return to Philadelphia in shame? Her teaching position had been filled, their small house sold to pay debts. Her mother and younger siblings had moved in with an aunt in Boston. Eleanor had burned her bridges, betting everything on this new life that now lay in ruins around her. She pulled the photograph from her reticule, the one she'd sent to James. In it, her face was angled just so, her dark hair arranged to frame her features at their most flattering. It wasn't a lie exactly, but perhaps a prettied-up version of truth. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Hobbs stood there with a steaming mug. "Thought you might need something stronger than tea," she said, offering a cup that smelled of honey and whiskey. Bad news goes down easier with a little sweetness to cut the bitter. Eleanor accepted the mug gratefully. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted, the words escaping before she could catch them. Mrs. Hobbs settled her ample frame on the room's only chair. "Well, that's a question best tackled after a night's sleep. But I will say this. Clearwater Springs isn't just James Miller and his pinch-faced sister. There's good folks here who judge by doing, not just looking. I don't have enough money to return east," Eleanor confessed, shame burning her cheeks. "I spent nearly everything to come here." "Then maybe you're not meant to go back," Mrs. Hobbs said simply. "Maybe there's something waiting for you here that's better than what you thought you wanted." As if answering her words, a fresh knock sounded at the boarding house door. Through the thin walls, Eleanor heard Mrs. Hobbs greet someone, their voices a low murmur she couldn't quite make out. Moments later, Mrs. Hobbs appeared again, holding a sealed note. "Messenger boy just brought this," she said, handing Eleanor the envelope. "Said it's urgent." The paper was thick and cream-colored, nothing like James Miller's expensive stationery. Eleanor broke the plain wax seal with trembling fingers, unfolding a letter written in a bold, somewhat untidy hand. The crash of breaking glass jolted Eleanor awake. Outside her window, drunken laughter echoed as men stumbled from the saloon across the street. She clutched her blanket tighter, feeling more alone than she ever had back east. Rain drummed against the boarding house roof, drowning out her quiet sobs. Morning brought no relief. Eleanor emptied her reticule onto the bed, counting each coin twice. The metal pieces gleamed in the weak sunlight, $7.43. Not nearly enough for a train ticket back to Philadelphia. James Miller had promised to help with her return fare, but his note today included only half the amount needed. Miscalculated expenses, his hurried scrawl explained. Business has been slow. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed. She'd sold her mother's good silver, her father's pocket watch, and nearly everything else to come west, all for a man who'd taken one look at her full figure and decided she wasn't worth keeping his word. A sharp knock startled her from her thoughts. Eleanor hastily wiped her eyes and smoothed her hair before opening the door. Mrs. Hobbs, the boarding house owner, stood there twisting her apron between weathered hands. "You're crying again, dearie." "Just homesick," Eleanor lied. Homesick doesn't empty a wash basin of tears 3 nights running. Mrs. Hobbs stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Town's been talking. That Miller man." She clicked her tongue. "Not the first mail-order bride he's sent back, though usually they're too skinny, too plain, or too sharp-tongued." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. "I suppose I'm a new category of disappointment." "His loss," Mrs. Hobbs declared firmly. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "Which brings me to this. Boy delivered it not 30 minutes ago. Said it's urgent." The paper felt heavy in Eleanor's hands. No return address marked the outside. Breaking the simple wax seal, she unfolded the note. "Miss Winters, word travels quickly in small towns. I understand you find yourself in need of employment. My children find themselves in need of care. Perhaps we might discuss an arrangement. The wagon will come at noon tomorrow if you're amenable. Thomas Hayes, Hayes Timber Mill." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She'd spotted the mill when her train arrived, a sprawling operation on the town's edge that buzzed with activity even from a distance. "Do you know Mr. Hayes?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Hobbs's face softened like butter on a warm day. "Widower. 3 little ones at home needing looking after. Keeps mostly to himself since his Mary passed birthing their youngest last winter. What kind of man is he?" Eleanor pressed, remembering how James Miller's charming letters had hidden his true character. Honest as daylight. Works alongside his men, rather than just giving orders. not one for fancy clothes or showing off. Mrs. Hobbs hesitated. Mary's death nearly broke him. Folks say he hardly spoke for months after, only started living again for those children's sake. And his appearance? Eleanor hated herself for asking, but after James Miller's disgusted her figure, she needed to prepare herself. Mrs. Hobbs chuckled. Strong as an ox from mill work. Handsome enough when he bothers to trim his beard, which hasn't been often since Mary passed. Her expression grew serious. But understand this. It's not marriage's offering, just employment. Those children need a woman's touch, something fierce. Eleanor studied the letter again. Employment meant independence. It meant not crawling back to Philadelphia to face her family's pitying looks. His children, what are they like? She asked. William's the oldest. 8 now, I reckon. Serious little fellow. Had to grow up fast helping with his siblings. Emma's 6. Wild as a March hare, but sweet-natured. And baby Joseph just turned 1 last month. Barely knew his mama. A family without a mother. A woman without a place. Perhaps this was God's hand at work after all. Please tell the messenger I'll be ready at noon tomorrow. Eleanor decided. After Mrs. Hobbs left, Eleanor stood before the small mirror hanging on her wall. The glass reflected her round cheeks, the softness beneath her chin, the fullness of her bosom that no corset could entirely disguise. Features that had brought her nothing but shame since girlhood. She thought of Mr. Hayes's children, motherless, needing care that had nothing to do with waistlines or society's rigid standards. For the first time since stepping off the train, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. Kneeling beside her trunk, she unlocked it and carefully unwrapped her mother's hand mirror from its silk cloth. The silver back was tarnished with age, but the glass remained clear. Eleanor studied her reflection in the fading afternoon light. The determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes that no one in this town had bothered to notice. Perhaps, she whispered to her reflection, there are places where worth isn't measured by the inch of one's waist. As thunder rolled across the darkening sky, Eleanor began sorting through her belongings, mind racing with questions about the mysterious Mr. Hayes and the new path suddenly opening before her. Would his children accept her? Could she truly build a life here after such a humiliating rejection? The unknown loomed both terrifying and thrilling as she prepared for tomorrow's meeting. Get down from there this instant. The shrill voice cut through the peaceful morning as Eleanor's wagon approached the Hayes property. A small figure dangled precariously from a tree branch while a harried-looking older woman stood below, hands on hips. The child, a girl with wild brown hair, swung her legs defiantly. Not until Pa comes home, the girl shouted. You can't make me eat that horrible mush. The wagon driver chuckled. That'd be Miss Emma. Quite the handful since her mama passed. Eleanor's stomach tightened. What had she gotten herself into? The wagon rounded a bend, revealing a 2-story home built of massive pine logs. Unlike the proper clapboard houses in town, this dwelling belonged to the forest surrounding it. A hand-built swing hung from a mighty oak, and smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney. Despite its rustic appearance, glass windows, a luxury this far from town, caught the midday sun, suggesting the mill owner's business prospered. As they approached, 3 small faces appeared at the windows. The girl in the tree froze mid-swing, staring. Mrs. Pettigrew, a boy's voice called from inside. Someone's coming. The older woman turned, squinting at the wagon before hurrying toward the house. William, bring Joseph inside right now. By the time the wagon stopped, a man emerged from around the side of the house, hammer in hand. Thomas Hayes wiped sawdust from his palms as he approached. Eleanor's breath caught slightly. He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders shaped by hard labor. His beard couldn't quite hide the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, yet his eyes remained alert, taking in her appearance with a directness that made her clutch her reticule tighter. "Miss Winters?" he asked, his voice deeper than she expected. Eleanor nodded, suddenly unable to find words. "Thank you for coming." He offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. His grip was strong, calloused, and did withdraw at the touch of her gloved hand. Most surprising. If he noticed her size, his expression gave no hint of judgment or disappointment. After James Miller's obvious disgust, the absence of such a reaction felt almost disorienting. "Mr. Hayes," she finally managed, "thank you for the opportunity." "The opportunity is mine," he replied simply. "The children have been without proper care since their mother's passing. Mrs. Pettigrew helps when she can, but her arthritis makes it difficult. I'm away at the mill most days." A sudden shriek interrupted them as the girl leapt from her tree perch, landing with practiced ease before darting toward them. The front door flew open, and a boy emerged, holding a toddler awkwardly on his hip. "Emma Hayes," called the older woman, presumably Mrs. Pettigrew, following behind. "Mind your manners." The children gathered in a curious half-circle, studying Eleanor with undisguised interest. The oldest boy stood straight-backed, attempting dignity despite the squirming toddler in his arms. The girl, Emma, bounced on her toes, twigs and leaves tangled in her unruly hair. "This is William," Thomas said as the boy stepped forward. "Emma you've already witnessed in her natural state." His tone carried a hint of warmth despite his stern expression. "And little Joseph just turned 1. Are you our new mother?" Emma blurted, earning an elbow from her brother. "Emma," William hissed. Eleanor felt heat rush to her cheeks. "I'm to be your caretaker," she clarified gently. William studied her with serious eyes beyond his years. "Can you cook?" he asked bluntly. "William," his father warned. "It's quite all right," Eleanor assured him. "Yes, William, I can cook quite well. I can also read stories, tend gardens," and she bent slightly to meet his eyes, "keep secrets when necessary." The boy's solemn expression cracked slightly. "Pa burns the biscuits." "Every time," Emma added, stepping closer. "They're black as coal and hard as rocks." Thomas's cheeks colored slightly above his beard. The children exaggerate wildly. "Not about the biscuits," Emma insisted with such conviction that Eleanor couldn't help laughing. A genuine sound that seemed to surprise everyone, herself included. When had she last laughed like that? Mrs. Pettigrew approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thank heavens you've come, Miss Winters. These children need a firm hand and a woman's touch. The little one's been fussy since dawn, won't take his milk." As if hearing his cue, Joseph began to cry, squirming harder in William's increasingly desperate grip. Without thinking, Eleanor stepped forward and held out her arms. "May I?" William surrendered his brother with obvious relief. Eleanor settled the toddler naturally against her hip, her substantial frame providing a comfortable perch for the child. Joseph's cries softened to hiccups as he studied her face with solemn blue eyes before reaching out to grab a lock of her hair, tugging with curious fingers. "He likes you," Emma observed, pressing closer. "That's the first time he hasn't screamed with a stranger," William added, sounding impressed despite himself. "Children and dogs," Thomas said quietly, watching the interaction. "Best judges of character I know." Mrs. Pettigrew huffed. "Well, I'll be on my way then. Got my own grandchildren to tend to." She patted Eleanor's arm as she passed. "Good luck, dear. They're good children at heart." As the older woman departed, Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps you'd like to see inside? Your room is prepared." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of Joseph's sticky fingers patting her cheek. The simple gesture of trust from this motherless child touched something deep within her. Is it true what they say in town? Emma asked, skipping alongside as they walked toward the house. "That lawyer man sent you away 'cause you're too big?" "Emma." Thomas's voice cracked like thunder. Eleanor froze, mortification washing over her. News had spread even to the children. William cuffed his sister's shoulder. "Shut up, Em." "I was just asking." Emma protested. "Mrs. Pettigrew told Widow Jenkins you were a mail-order bride that got sent back, and I wondered if—" "That's quite enough," Thomas interrupted firmly. "Miss Winters is our guest and your new caretaker. Her previous arrangements are none of our concern." Eleanor found her voice despite the burning in her cheeks. "It's all right, Mr. Hayes. Children are naturally curious." She looked directly at Emma. "Yes, I came to marry someone who changed his mind when he saw me. Sometimes people make promises they don't intend to keep." Emma studied her with surprising intensity. That was mean of him. Yes, Eleanor agreed simply. It was... Pa says promises matter more than anything, William stated, his expression suggesting he was quoting a frequent lesson. Thomas cleared his throat. Let's show Miss Winters her room. She's had a long journey. As they entered the house, Eleanor noticed 100 small details that spoke of a home struggling without a woman's touch. Mismatched curtains hanging unevenly, a layer of dust on the mantel, patches on the children's clothes that had clearly been sewn by inexpert hands. Yet there were also signs of care, fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table, a shelf of well-worn books, a doll carefully placed on a chair. The toddler in her arms had settled his head against her shoulder, his small body growing heavy with sleep. His complete trust, the weight of him against her, felt profoundly right. In that moment, as Joseph's breath evened out in slumber, Eleanor felt something shift within her, a loosening of the tight knot of shame that had formed in her chest at James Miller's rejection. Here, surrounded by chaos and need, her size didn't seem to matter. What mattered were her capable hands, her knowledge of household arts, her willingness to care. For the first time since arriving in Clearwater Springs, Eleanor felt herself drawing a full breath without the constriction of others' judgment pressing against her ribs. He never sleeps for strangers, William whispered, watching his brother with unconcealed amazement. Thomas stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he watched Eleanor with his youngest son. It seems you have a gift, Miss Winters. Not a gift, she replied softly, careful not to wake Joseph. Just practice. I helped raise my younger siblings after my mother fell ill. Something passed across Thomas's face. Recognition, perhaps, of shared experience. Then perhaps you're exactly where you need to be. Emma tugged at Eleanor's skirt. Will you tell us a story tonight? Pa tries, but he always falls asleep before the end. I would be delighted to, Eleanor promised. As sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the imperfect home around her, Eleanor realized she had found something unexpected. Not the respectable marriage she journeyed west to find, but perhaps something more precious, a place where she might be valued for what she could offer rather than judged for how she appeared. Snow fell in thick swirls outside the window as Eleanor rushed to throw another log on the fire. The bitter Montana winter had trapped him indoors for 3 days straight, and young Joseph's fever spiked dangerously high. His small face burned red against the white pillowcase as he tossed fitfully. Please drink a little more, sweet boy, Eleanor coaxed, lifting his head to sip the willow bark tea. The child's eyes fluttered open, the same deep brown as his father's, then closed again as he turned away from the cup. Thomas burst through the door, snow crusting his beard, clutching a small package. The doctor sent medicine, he panted, his voice ragged from his 4-mile journey through the blizzard. Said to give him 3 drops every 4 hours. Eleanor's hands trembled as she uncorked the tiny bottle. What if it's not enough? What if... Thomas caught her fingers in his. You haven't slept in 2 days. Let me sit with him while you rest. I can't leave him, she whispered, tears welling up. The thought of losing this child, any of these children, tore at her heart in ways she hadn't believed possible 6 months ago. Then we'll watch together, Thomas said, pulling a chair beside hers. Through that endless night, they took turns bathing Joseph's forehead with cool cloths, counting each shallow breath. William and Emma appeared at the doorway occasionally, their young faces pinched with worry, until Eleanor finally convinced them to sleep in her bed across the hall. Near dawn, Joseph's fever broke. His breathing steadied, and his small hand unclenched from its tight fist. Eleanor sagged against Thomas's shoulder, exhaustion and relief flooding through her. You saved him, Thomas murmured into her hair. We saved him, she corrected, too tired to move away from the improper closeness. The following weeks brought a transformation to the Hayes home, not just in Joseph's recovery, but in the rhythm of their lives. Eleanor hung curtains she'd sewn from feeds sacks dyed with berries. Rag rugs appeared on the rough floors. The smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen daily. William's serious face softened as she taught him chess by the fire each evening. You're not supposed to let me win, he accused one night after capturing her queen too easily. Who says I let you win? Eleanor replied with a wink that made the boy grin. Emma's wild hair finally submitted to neat plaits each morning as Eleanor hummed songs from her childhood. Mama wore her hair like this, Emma confided one morning, touching the ribbons Eleanor had tied. But I don't remember how she did it. Then we'll remember together, Eleanor said, showing Emma's fingers how to weave the strands. Joseph, fully recovered, toddled after Eleanor constantly. His first clear word version of her name, Ella, he would cry, arms raised to be lifted. Soon it became her name to all of them, a special word that meant belonging. As January's bitter cold gave way to February's gentler chill, Eleanor noticed small changes in Thomas. The mill owner, once so reserved, revealed himself through quiet gestures. Wildflowers in a jar on her breakfast table, a bookshelf built for her cherished books, paths cleared through snow before she woke. On Valentine's Day, a package arrived with the mill supplies, a bolt of blue calico fabric that matched Eleanor's eyes. For a new dress, Thomas mumbled, suddenly shy, with spring coming. That evening, after measuring the fabric against her shoulders, Eleanor caught a glimpse of herself in her mother's hand mirror. Her cheeks remained full, her figure still ample, but something had changed. Her eyes sparkled with purpose. Her posture spoke of belonging. The change came not from becoming smaller, but from growing into herself. When March winds howled outside, disaster struck the mill. A support beam cracked, bringing down part of the roof during a late winter storm. No one was hurt, but Thomas returned home covered in sawdust, his expression grim. The bank won't extend more credit, he explained that night after the children slept. Without repairs, we can't fill the railroad contract by spring. Eleanor thought of the small savings she'd set aside from her wages. How much do you need? Thomas looked up sharply. I couldn't take your money. It's not charity, she said firmly. It's investment. This is my home, too. Thomas. These children, this place. Her voice caught. I care what happens here. His calloused hand covered hers across the table. You've brought life back to this house, he said simply. Eleanor's heart fluttered. The house had life before. It just needed tending. Not just the house. His eyes, catching lamplight, held hers steadily. The children. Myself. Her cheeks warmed. I've done only what needed doing. You've done far more, Thomas replied softly. You're not merely useful here, Eleanor. You're essential. The word hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. Christmas was so chaotic with Joseph's illness that I never gave you this. Inside lay a silver thimble, polished to shine and engraved with tiny vines. It was my mother's, he explained. I noticed yours was wearing thin. Eleanor closed her fingers around this small token that honored her daily work. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The mill will survive, Thomas said with new determination. And come spring, perhaps we might discuss other arrangements. That night, in the privacy of her room, Eleanor studied herself again in the mirror. The woman who looked back wasn't the rejected bride who'd stepped off the train months ago. This woman had weathered crises, nurtured children back to health, and found strength she never knew she possessed. The transformation had nothing to do with her outward appearance and everything to do with being valued for who she truly was. Outside, the first tentative drops of spring rain began to melt the winter's snow. The crash of breaking glass jolted Eleanor awake. Downstairs, angry voices clashed like thunder. She grabbed her shawl, rushing down to find Thomas facing 3 rain-soaked men in the kitchen doorway. You can't shut down the South Road, Hayes. The tallest man jabbed a finger toward Thomas's chest. That's the only way to my property. Your cattle are destroying the bridge. Winters. No relation to Miss Winters here. Thomas added quickly as Eleanor appeared. One more heavy rain and it'll collapse. The cattle rancher's gaze snapped to Eleanor, his eyes narrowing as he took in her nightdress and shawl, her loose hair falling around her shoulders. Well now, he drawled, didn't realize you had company. Heat rushed to Eleanor's face, but she lifted her chin and stepped forward. Mr. Hayes has 3 children sleeping upstairs, Mr. Winters. I suggest you lower your voice. The rancher's smirk vanished. His companions shifted awkwardly. The road stays closed until the bridge is fixed. Thomas said firmly, I've already ordered lumber. After the men left, Eleanor swept up the broken glass from the lantern they'd knocked over. People talk about us, she said quietly. Thomas knelt beside her, helping gather the larger pieces. Does that bother you? She met his eyes. Not for myself. For the children. For you. Let them talk, he said. We know the truth. The truth was becoming harder to define. Eleanor's role had shifted from hired, help to something without a proper name. The children now rushed to her with skinned knees and treasured findings alike. Thomas sought her advice on mill business and future plans. At night, their conversations lingered by the fire long after the children were asleep. Once, their hands had brushed while passing a teacup, and neither had pulled away for several heartbeats. One evening in May, as dogwood blossoms perfumed the warming air, Thomas announced they would all journey into town for supplies, and perhaps ice cream, a declaration that brought squeals of delight from Emma and William. Eleanor's stomach twisted into knots. I have bread to bake, she protested. The garden needs weeding. Thomas studied her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. You haven't been to town since you arrived. The mill wagon brings what we need, she said, folding laundry with unnecessary force. Not everything, Thomas replied softly. The children miss showing you off. They're proud of their Ella. She paused, a small shirt half folded in her hands. People will stare. They'll remember how I arrived, unwanted, rejected, and they'll see who you are now, cherished, essential. His hand covered hers, warm and steady. Besides, you've sewn that beautiful blue dress. Shame to save it just for Sundays at home. The next morning, Eleanor found herself on Clearwater Springs Main Street, wearing her new calico dress with its clever seaming that made the most of her figure. William held one hand, Emma the other, while Joseph rode proudly on Thomas's shoulders. The town had grown since her arrival 9 months ago. New storefronts lined the street, and unfamiliar faces mingled with those she remembered. To her surprise, several people nodded greetings. Mrs. Hobbs from the boarding house even rushed over to embrace her. Look at you, the older woman exclaimed, blooming like a June rose. At the general store, Eleanor selected buttons for William's school shirt, while Thomas discussed nail prices with the shopkeeper. The children explored barrels of candy with solemn concentration, their task of choosing one treat each undertaken with great seriousness. The bell above the door jingled. Eleanor looked up and froze. James Miller stood in the doorway, his sister Prudence at his elbow. The lawyer's gaze locked with Eleanor's, his expression shifting rapidly from surprise to confusion to something harder to name. Prudence recovered first. Why, Miss Winters? How? Unexpected to find you still in the territory. Eleanor's mouth went dry. She forced herself to nod politely. Miss Miller, Mr. Miller, how nice to see you both. Emma tugged at her skirt. Ella, who are these people? Just some folks I met when I first came to town, Eleanor explained, squeezing the child's hand. Thomas appeared beside her, Joseph still balanced on his shoulders. James, he acknowledged with a nod. Prudence. Mr. Hayes, James replied stiffly. I wasn't aware you'd employed domestic help. Miss Winters is far more than help, Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. She's become the heart of our home. Prudence's thin lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How fortunate for everyone involved. Although, her gaze traveled deliberately over Eleanor's figure, I'm surprised you find the arrangement suitable. The old shame threatened to rise in Eleanor's chest, but something new rose faster, anger. This woman, who had helped orchestrate her humiliation, still thought Eleanor's worth could be measured by inches at the waist. Before she could respond, Thomas's hand came to rest at the small of her back, a gesture of such natural intimacy that it silenced the room. More than suitable, Thomas replied, his deep voice steady. Perfect, in fact. The shopkeeper cleared his throat loudly. Your nails are ready, Mr. Hayes, and I've set aside those peppermint sticks for the little ones. James adjusted his collar. Well, we mustn't keep you from your errands. As the Millers turned to leave, James paused beside Eleanor. "You look well," he said quietly. "Different somehow." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I'm exactly who I was, Mr. Miller. You simply failed to see it." The bell jangled as the door closed behind them. Eleanor realized she'd been holding her breath and released it slowly. "Those were the people who were mean to you?" William asked, his young face serious. "The ones who made you sad?" "How did you know they made me sad?" Eleanor asked, surprised by the boy's perception. "Your hands got tight," he explained, demonstrating by clenching his small fists, like when Joseph has a bad dream. Emma pressed against Eleanor's skirts. "I don't like them," she declared. "They looked at you funny." Thomas knelt to eye level with his children. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people judge others by the wrong things. They miss what's truly important. Like how Ella tells the best stories and makes the best pie and knows how to fix everything," Emma offered. "And how she doesn't get scared of snakes or when I fall out of trees," William added. Joseph, from his perch on his father's shoulders, patted Eleanor's head and declared, "My Ella!" Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes as these three small people defended her worth with such certainty. Thomas stood, his expression tender as he watched her face. "Old acquaintances?" he asked quietly as the children were distracted by the promised peppermint. Eleanor nodded. "He was why I came to Clearwater Springs. He sent for me as a bride." Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. "And he rejected you because I wasn't what he expected," she finished. "Not pretty enough. Not slender enough. Not enough." Thomas's hand found hers, his callous fingers entwining with her softer ones. "His loss," he said simply, and in those two words, Eleanor found her final liberation from shame. Later that afternoon, as they passed the millinery shop, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the window glass. The woman looking back wore a blue dress that matched her eyes, her cheeks flushed with color, her posture straight and confident. 3 children crowded around her skirts, and beside her stood a man whose gaze, when it fell upon her, held nothing but admiration. "Ice cream," Thomas announced, steering them toward the confectioner's shop. "I believe I promised certain young people a treat for good behavior." As they entered the shop, heads turned. Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares, heard the whispers behind raised hands. But for the first time in her life, she didn't shrink from the attention. Let them look. Let them see that Eleanor Winters, once dismissed, once deemed unworthy, now stood at the center of a family who valued her exactly as she was. The truth of who she had become couldn't be measured by a dress size or the approval of others. It lived in William's chess victories, in Emma's neatly plaited hair, in Joseph's first words. It bloomed in the garden she'd planted, in the home she'd transformed, in the man who now pulled out her chair and asked with a smile, "Vanilla or chocolate?" Summer burst across the Hayes property with a riot of color. Purple wildflowers bent in the breeze, while butterflies danced from bloom to bloom. The creek bubbled with fresh snow melt, cool and inviting on hot afternoons when the children splashed and shrieked with joy. For Eleanor, watching Emma learn to swim and William master his fishing skills became precious moments stored away like treasures. One sweltering July afternoon, the Hayes kitchen transformed into an impromptu medical ward when 8-year-old William burst through the door, his arm cradled against his chest, face streaked with dirt and tears. "Fell from the oak," he gasped as Eleanor rushed to him, trying to build a fort. Eleanor's hands moved with calm purpose despite her racing heart. "Let me see, brave boy." The arm wasn't broken, just badly bruised, but the gash on his forehead needed attention. As she cleaned and bandaged his wounds, William watched her face with a curious expression. "Aren't you scared of blood?" he asked, wincing as she dabbed at his cut. Eleanor smiled. "A little, but being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave, too." The boy's eyes, so like his father's, studied her. "Is that why you came here after that fancy lawyer man was mean to you? Miss Hobbs told Mrs. Parker you were brave to stay." Eleanor's hand stilled. "You know about Mr. Miller?" William nodded solemnly. "Everyone knows. Emma says you're prettier than Miss Miller anyway, and Pa says—" He stopped suddenly, looking guilty. "What does your father say?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William fidgeted with his bandage. Says you're the best thing that ever happened to us after Ma died. That evening, after the children were tucked in, William with extra pillows for his sore arm and promises of fishing lessons when he healed, Eleanor sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies rise from the grass like tiny lanterns. The air smelled of pine and the sweet tobacco Thomas sometimes smoked in his pipe after supper. The creak of footsteps on wooden boards announced his arrival before she saw him. He carried 2 glasses of lemonade, the slices of lemon floating atop like little yellow boats. William will be fine, Eleanor said as he sat beside her, though I expect he'll be more careful climbing trees for a while. Thomas chuckled. Until next week, at least. He handed her a glass, their fingers brushing. You've changed him. All of them, really. Children bounce back. They're stronger than we think. Not just the children. Thomas's voice dropped lower, intimate in the gathering twilight. I was half dead when you arrived, Eleanor, going through the motions for their sake. A frog began its evening song down by the creek, joined soon by a chorus of others. Eleanor sipped her lemonade, tart and sweet on her tongue. And now I find myself looking forward to each day again, wondering what small miracle you'll perform next, making Joseph say his letters, or teaching Emma to bake those cinnamon rolls, or simply filling this house with laughter. Heat crept up Eleanor's neck, warming her cheeks. I'm just doing what needs doing. Thomas set his glass aside and turned to face her fully. That day in town with the Millers, I wanted to tell that pompous fool exactly what he'd thrown away. His hand found hers on the swing between them, but then I realized I should be thanking him instead. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Thomas, a week from now is the town's Founders' Day celebration, he continued, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Everyone will be there, music, dancing, fireworks over the lake. I remember you mentioned it, Eleanor said, her heart beating so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. I'd like us to go, as a family. He paused, swallowing visibly. But first, I need to ask you something important. Before he could continue, the screen door banged open and little Joseph toddled out in his nightshirt, thumb in mouth, eyes heavy with interrupted sleep. Bad dream, sweet boy. Eleanor opened her arms, and the toddler climbed into her lap, nestling against her softness with complete trust. Thomas watched them, something unreadable in his expression. We'll finish this conversation, he promised quietly. The next day brought unexpected visitors. Cousins from 2 counties over, arriving with their wagon piled high with trunks and supplies. Thomas! Bellowed a barrel-chested man with Thomas's eyes and jawline. Surprise! Cousin Frank, Thomas greeted, looking genuinely shocked as 3 more people climbed down from the wagon, a woman with graying hair and 2 young men who looked to be in their late teens. Heading to Oregon territory, but thought we'd visit on the way, Frank announced, slapping Thomas on the back. This must be your housekeeper Margaret wrote us about. Eleanor stood awkwardly on the porch, dust from the wagon swirling around her skirts. Eleanor Winters, Thomas corrected firmly, and she's far more than a housekeeper to this family. Frank's wife Martha sized Eleanor up with curious eyes that held no judgment, only friendly interest. Well, whoever you are, I hope you can teach me that biscuit recipe Margaret bragged about in her last letter. Ours always turn out hard as river rocks. The Hayes home burst with activity for the next 5 days. Beds arranged in every corner, meals stretched to feed hungry travelers, stories and laughter filling every room. Eleanor found herself swept into the family circle without question, included in reminiscences about Mary with kindness rather than comparison. On the visitor's final evening, after a grand farewell supper, Thomas asked Eleanor to help him fetch more firewood for the outdoor fire, where the men were trading tall tales beneath the stars. Instead of heading to the woodpile, he led her to the old oak tree, William's nearly healed injury forgotten in the excitement of cousins who taught him to whittle. I've been trying to get you alone all week, Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. There's something I can't wait any longer to ask. In the blue twilight, Eleanor could just make out the lines of his face. The strong jaw now clean-shaven since the spring, the crow's feet at his eyes from squinting in the sun at the mill, the small scar above his lip from a childhood fall. "Before you ask," she whispered, "you should know. I received a letter from Philadelphia yesterday. My sister is ill. She's asked me to return, at least for a while." Thomas's face fell. "You're leaving?" "I haven't decided." Eleanor wrung her hands. "She's my only blood family, Thomas. I should be there for her, as she was for me after our parents died." He stood very still. "And after? Would you return west?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Eleanor thought of William's brave face as she bandaged his wounds, of Emma's delighted giggles when they made cookies together, of Joseph's small hand in hers as they gathered eggs each morning. She thought of this man before her, who looked at her curves not with disappointment but with appreciation, who sought her opinions on mill business, who brought her wildflowers arranged in clumsy bunches by his work-roughened hands. "That depends," she managed, her voice shaking slightly. Thomas moved closer, close enough that she could smell the cedar scent of his soap. "On what? On whether I'd be returning as your employee or—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew something that gleamed in the fading light, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. He would later tell her. "I had a whole speech planned," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "about how you brought this family back to life, about how watching you and my children makes me believe in second chances, about how your kindness and strength humble me daily." Eleanor's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. "Thomas." But none of those fancy words matter as much as the simple truth. He took her hand, the ring poised at her fingertip. "I love you, Eleanor Winters, not despite your size, but including it. Every inch of you is precious to me. Your laugh, your mind, your heart. Will you marry me and make this family whole again?" A shower of sparks rose from the distant fire as someone added a fresh log. Against the darkening sky, they looked like stars falling instead of rising. "The town will talk," Eleanor whispered, years of judgment rising in her mind. "They'll say you settle for less than you deserve." Thomas's laugh was soft as summer rain. "Eleanor, you are more, not less. More compassion, more joy, more strength than this family ever hoped for." In that moment, beneath branches that had sheltered generations of Hayes' children, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. Not a physical change, but a spiritual one, as if her soul had finally expanded to its proper size. "Yes," she whispered, the single word containing all the dreams she'd never dared to voice. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if made for her, and gathered her into his arms. Their first kiss tasted of promise and belonging, sweet as wild honey and just as natural. Later, as they walked hand in hand back toward the fire and the waiting family, Eleanor realized that for the first time in her life, she was not thinking about how others saw her body. Instead, she was thinking only of how it felt to finally, truly be home. Thunder cracked across the sky as Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway of the general store. Packages clutched her chest, rain beginning to splatter the wooden sidewalk. Across the muddy street, James Miller helped Prudence from their carriage, his eyes lifting to lock with Eleanor's before she could duck back inside. "Mrs. Hayes." His voice carried over the rumble of approaching storm clouds. "A moment, if you please." 6 months had passed since her wedding day. 6 months of happiness in the Hayes household that now truly felt like her own. 6 months of watching Thomas's smile grow easier, the children flourish, and her own confidence bloom like the wild roses that climbed the garden fence. Eleanor hesitated, every instinct urging her to avoid this confrontation. But she was no longer the shame-filled woman who'd arrived on that train a year and a half ago. "Mr. Miller," she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady as he crossed the street toward her, mud splashing his polished boots. Up close, James looked older, lines of worry etched around his mouth. "I hear congratulations are in order. The entire town speaks of nothing but the Hayes family's good fortune these days." Eleanor shifted her packages, unsure how to respond to his strained politeness. "Thomas and the children bring me great joy." "Indeed." James cleared his throat, glancing back at his sister, who watched them with narrowed eyes from beneath her umbrella. "I've been meaning to, that is, I should have." Fat raindrops began to fall in earnest now, splattering Eleanor's navy blue dress. Not the one she arrived in, but new ones sewn with her own hands, cut to flatter rather than hide her figure. "You're getting wet, Mr. Miller," she observed. "Yes, well," he squared his shoulders. "I wanted to apologize. My behavior when you first arrived was unworthy of a gentleman." Eleanor blinked in surprise. Of all the things she might have expected, an apology wasn't among them. "I made judgments based on appearances," he continued stiffly. "I failed to see what Hayes so clearly recognized." A crack of lightning illuminated his face. Sincere, if uncomfortable. Eleanor felt the last hard knot of hurt inside her chest begin to loosen. "Thank you," she said simply. "Though as it happens, I should be grateful. Your rejection led me to true happiness." Something flickered across James's face. Regret, perhaps. Hayes is a fortunate man. Before Eleanor could reply, a small voice called from down the street. "Mama, Mama Eleanor." Emma ran toward them, yellow dress splattered with mud, pigtails flying. Behind her came Thomas, carrying Joseph on his shoulders, William at his side. "We've been looking everywhere for you," Emma declared, grabbing Eleanor's hand. "Pa says the storm's coming fast, and we need to get home." Thomas approached more slowly, his expression cautious, as he noted Eleanor's companion. "Miller," he greeted with a nod. "Hayes." James stepped back, straightening his coat. "You have a fine family." "I'm well aware," Thomas replied, shifting Joseph to his hip, and put his free arm around Eleanor's waist in a gesture both protective and possessive. William tugged at Eleanor's skirt. "Ma, can we have those molasses cookies tonight? You promised." The simple word, "Ma," hung in the air between them all. Eleanor saw James register it, saw something like wonder cross his face. "Of course, sweet boy," she said, ruffling William's hair, "if we beat the storm home." As the Hayes family turned to leave, James called after them, "Mrs. Hayes?" Eleanor looked back, rain beginning to soak through her bonnet. "You look—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Transformed." Eleanor smiled, feeling Thomas's steady presence beside her. "Not transformed, Mr. Miller. Simply seen." The storm broke in earnest as they drove their wagon home, rain drumming on the canvas cover, the children singing loudly between claps of thunder. Eleanor sat beside Thomas on the driver's bench, his arm warm against hers despite their wet clothes. "What did Miller want?" he asked, voice low enough that the children couldn't hear over their singing. "To apologize," Eleanor replied, still somewhat surprised by it, "and perhaps to understand what he missed." Thomas's laugh rumbled like distant thunder. "His loss. My gain." Back at the Hayes home, as lightning flashed outside the windows, they created an impromptu picnic on the parlor floor, bread and cheese, and the promised molasses cookies, with cups of hot chocolate to ward off the chill. "Tell us the story again," Emma begged, crumbs dotting her chin, "about how you and Pa got married." "You've heard it a dozen times," Eleanor protested, but without conviction. "Please, Ma." William added, his recent growth spurt making him look more like Thomas every day. "The part where you thought Pa burned all the biscuits." Joseph, now nearly 2 and full of mischief, climbed into her lap. "Story?" he demanded, sticky fingers patting her cheeks. Eleanor caught Thomas's eye over the children's heads. His smile held all the love she'd once doubted she deserved. "Well," she began, settling Joseph more comfortably against her. "Once upon a time, there was a woman who traveled very far to find a home. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the storm had passed, leaving behind a wash-clean world of puddles and fresh air, Thomas found Eleanor in the kitchen, putting away the last of the dishes. 'I have something to show you,' he said, taking her hand. He led her upstairs to their bedroom, where a large object stood covered with a sheet beside the window. "Thomas," Eleanor questioned. "I've been working on it at the mill during lunch hours," he explained, suddenly looking nervous. "For your birthday next week. But after seeing Miller today, well, I didn't want to wait." He pulled away the sheet to reveal a full-length mirror in a hand-carved wooden frame, more elegant and beautiful than anything Eleanor had ever owned. Roses and oak leaves twined around the edges, carved with painstaking detail. "Oh," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful." "Look," Thomas urged gently. Eleanor stood before the mirror, seeing herself clearly in the lamplight. The fullness of her figure in her simple house dress, the curves that had once been a source of shame now simply part of who she was. But more than that, she saw the confidence in her posture, the brightness in her eyes, the easy smile that came so naturally now. "What do you see?" Thomas asked, coming to stand behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. Eleanor studied their reflection, the tall, strong man and the full-figure woman, so different and yet so perfectly matched. "I see a woman who found her place in the world," she answered honestly, not by changing herself, but by finding those who valued her as she was. Thomas's arms circled her waist, drawing her back against his chest. "I see the love of my life," he murmured against her hair, "the mother my children adore, the woman who brought laughter back into this house." In the garden below their window, crickets began their evening chorus. From the children's room came Joseph's soft snores and the creak of William's bed as he turned in his sleep. "Do you ever wonder," Eleanor asked quietly, "what might have happened if James Miller had been kin to that first day?" Thomas considered this, his expression thoughtful in the mirror. "Sometimes fate knows better than we do what we truly need." His arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day that Miller was a fool." Eleanor turned in his embrace, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "As do I." The next morning dawned clear and bright after the storm. Eleanor woke early, slipping from bed without waking Thomas, and padded downstairs to start breakfast. She opened the front door to fetch the milk bottles and found a small package on the step, wrapped in brown paper and string. No note, no explanation. Inside was a book, leather-bound and clearly expensive. Poems of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the gold lettering announced. The volume fell open naturally to "How Do I Love Thee?" And there, pressed between the pages, was a single dried rose. Eleanor knew without being told who had left it, a final apology, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of what might have been. She closed the book gently and placed it on the shelf in the parlor. It would make a fine addition to the family library. This unexpected gift from a man who had once wounded her deeply. From upstairs came the thunder of small feet as the children woke, ready for their morning hugs and breakfast demands. The sound of Thomas's deeper tread followed, his voice warm as he guided Joseph down the stairs. Eleanor moved toward them, toward the family that had chosen her as she had chosen them. In this house, she had found not just acceptance, but celebration of all she was. As autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the simple kitchen in gold, Eleanor Hayes, once Eleanor Winters, once a mail-order bride rejected and heartbroken, opened her arms wide to embrace the life she never could have imagined. Not a life where she'd been made beautiful by someone else's judgment, but one where she discovered the beauty that had been there all along, waiting only for the right eyes to see it and the right heart, her own, to claim it.